My name is Paul Nguyen. Today is July 23rd, 2011. We're here at the Our Lord's, Our Lady of the Lord's Church in Denver, Colorado. And we're interviewing Mr. Demian Smith, and is part of the 500 Oral Histories Project for the Vietnamese American Heritage Foundation. If you would please state your full name and when and where you were born.
Now, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
If we do this? If you do it in that kind of format, it's going to be really stilted.
Well, I mean, this is just the introduction. We just want to
Okay.
get some of this out of the way, and then we'll have a conversation.
Okay. Well, I'm Demian Smith, and I was born here in Denver, Colorado. I was born in a Spanish-speaking area of town, in a poor part of town. I learned to speak Spanish on the street there. The truth is I had a Spanish accent as I grew up as a young child, and have traveled most of the United States, a lot of parts of Mexico, a good part of Vietnam. At this point in time, I'm an attorney, and my practice is multicultural. Along with the fact that I speak Spanish, I have two Vietnamese interpreters in the office and a Cambodian interpreter, and we deal with Southeast Asian refugees and their families and their children regarding various aspects of the law. I have also taught courses in the local schools here regarding for the new refugees, talking about what they can expect from the legal system in the United States, what our Constitution means, what they need to know about the difference between living in a totalitarian government and a government that has more responsibility for the privacy and rights of its citizens.
It sounds like your line of work is very specifically curtailed. I would like to get a little bit of a background narration to see kind of how you got to where you are today. Can you talk about what it was like going through school, and at what point did you decide that law was something that interests you?
Actually, the story behind that is that when I left home when I was just turned 17 years old, and I worked tutoring students that had learning difficulties at a local elementary school at the same time as I went to high school. From there, I had the main jobs that I've had, and I've had lots of different jobs, were that I was a carpenter, and I also was a long-distance truck driver. During the time when I was a carpenter, I worked with a fellow who was my supervisor, who came to me one day and said, after we had long conversations about the world and life and what the opportunities were, he told me he had good news and bad news. The good news was if I wanted it first, he would give me the good news, bad news, or the bad news. I said, well, give me the bad news. He says, you're fired. And I asked him, okay, then what's the good news? He says, the good news is that you need to go to school. After that, I studied in a tradition I went to work part-time, and I started to go and very slowly accumulate my college degree at night, while I worked during the day at various jobs that would allow me to do that.
What degree were you pursuing?
Well, my degree is in political science. It is also in pre-Columbian archaeology and in Spanish literature.
And what made you decide political science?
The political science was really a function of trying to remain aware of the political situation in the United States during that time, as at that point in time I was dealing with a lot of groups that were Hispanic, and it was a time of tremendous racism with Hispanic students.
What time period was this, and how old were you?
Well, I was probably by the time I got into school, I was in my 20s, and this would be the late 60s, and so I belonged to a number of different organizations that basically work to provide rights for immigrants, also to look at the difficulties that other countries where there were totalitarian governments, and the United States was involved in a way that only created more difficulties for people. And so the truth is that I was head of a number of different Hispanic organizations throughout the time that I was in school itself. I graduated from school. I started working for a couple of different lawyers. I worked as a private investigator for a period of time, and actually, in my own religion, my teacher, who I was his principal student, came to me one day and said, "You know, now you seem to have a comfortable life." He said, "What is it that you can do that you have never dreamed that you would do, but you've always wanted?" And I said, "Well, I've always thought about becoming a lawyer so I would be able to have some influence on what the situation is for the individual, you know, and not just the group." And so he gave me the task of becoming a lawyer. And I went to law school. By that time I had kids. I worked and went full-time to law school and took care of my kids.
Okay, so you had a job, full-time law school, and kids.
Yes, and I was a single father.
And that must have been tough. I imagine that's...
3 hours of sleep a night for 4 years.
How did you manage?
I managed it because it was for something greater than myself. We can all decide on our careers based on, you know, depending on how much money we would like to have in our pockets every month and what we could do, and you know, those sorts of things. But I think the way that I did it is that it looked to me as though that there had to be, you know, some people who were in the practice of law that could, along with being able to feed their families, participate in cases that would be of some impact. And I think it's always easier that if you aren't in the center of yourself and you think of the world as a whole, to do something, because the real energy for being able to accomplish something never comes from our own individual egos or needs. So, you know, I bit the bullet, and I graduated in the upper 10% of my law school class, and I went to work with a group of lawyers who sued nursing homes. We also did civil rights work in a number of different areas. Nursing homes at that point in time were unregulated. They were very scary places. And we actually had a movie that was made about our work regarding one client who was a young man who was had a nerve disorder that made it so that he could not speak or move, and he managed to get a hold of us. He could hold a pencil in his mouth, and he wrote a note and got it to a nurse, and he said, "Help me." And he turned out to be this tremendous poet, this unbelievable man. And they kept him in a room in the dark. They kept the shades shut all the time. And so that's where we began to work on legislative reform for people who regarding the nursing homes themselves. I worked on projects that had to do with massive pollution at different water sites around Colorado, and I was and still am involved with a group of people who called Atlantis Adapt, and they are people who are wheelchair bound or have different really strong physical difficulties. What we did in that respect is that we helped write part of the Americans with Disability Act, and we also convinced the state of Colorado and the federal government to allow thousands of people to exit nursing homes and live in their own apartments and be independent and have a life that was genuinely theirs, instead of being warehoused in places that we felt we could save money, which we weren't saving money. During that period of time, I came in contact with the Vietnamese community because our offices were right across the hall from an agency that helped immigrants come in and try to adjust. This was what I think you described as the first great wave of immigrants that came after the war collapsed and people came in.
Do you recall the agency's name?
Well, I believe it was the Pacific Asian Development Association.
Okay.
And little by little we became involved with cases that had to do with immigrants from the Asian communities, Laotians actually at the beginning, Hmong, Vietnamese. We didn't see Cambodian clients for a long time because the Cambodians who lived in Vietnam weren't allowed to leave for years and years and years. I married a Vietnamese wife.
How many years after you started working for that firm?
Oh, it was quite a few years after that. And
how did you meet?
How did I meet her? Another Vietnamese friend of mine introduced us and whispered in my ear. She says, if this works out, she says, you have to bring me a pig's head.
Yeah, well, what's the significance of the pig head? Did she explain that?
Yes, that if she's the one who ties you together, then the pig head is given to her in honor of the fact that she had brought two loves together. It was a ritual, an act.
And when she described this and made this request, what was your initial reaction? How did you feel about that?
After I lived in Mexico for a number of years. All of the places I lived here were all multiracial and multicultural, including American Indians, different rituals. My feeling is that was an act of great respect. And for me, that one of the things that I felt all the way through my college education, through my upbringing, through everything that I've done, is that the United States should be a harbor for people who are fleeing oppression. But it should not be a place where they lose their identity, their cultures, and their way of lives. And the fact is that my respect and interest in all of the different cultures that inhabit the country is huge. And so when she asked me that, to me, that was a request to enter into her particular cultural aspect of this, and it was just part of my own feeling that I don't like to be on the outside with my clients in the way that I work today. The best thing that I have is the fact that with my wife being able to translate in Cambodian and Vietnamese and my other translators, that not only that, we participate in charities, we participate in foundations, we help fund different organizations Um, we work with organizations to provide food and supplies to orphan children. At one point in time, along almost the same time that I was just beginning to work with the Vietnamese community, a few lawyers got together and we built a orphanage in Vietnam and staffed it. And so, culture is a precious thing, and to have a culture and to be able to look to the heart of it, not just the surface, and to be able to keep it and pass it down from one generation to another is a tremendously difficult thing in the United States. And that if a culture wants to preserve itself, it has to be strong, and it has to realize the importance of what it means to be a member of a place of national origin, a member of a tribe, a member of a culture, and have some respect for that, respect for your elders, respect for the traditions. And I think that probably is the sweetest part of life, to be able to do that.
I want to rewind back to your anecdote about how you met your wife. You were introduced by this mutual friend, and I'm curious, how long did it take for you to propose?
We married in about a year.
About a year.
Mm-hmm.
And during that year, do you remember how the dynamics worked as far as the relationship, given the cultural understanding that you have and the open mind that you have, and her distinct Vietnamese heritage?
I'm Scotch, Irish, English, German. I have some Italian inside of me. Born in the United States. And so the cultural differences that arise, and I think the cultural differences that are the hardest to see, are not the ones on the outside. Dragon boat festivals and other sorts of things, weddings and all of the things that that continue to go on. People from different cultures view the world, from a very basic place in their hearts, in different ways. In other words, my job was to find out what not to do. Right? How is it that you don't offend? How is it that my first real contact with Vietnamese, you have to understand, was when I was a lawyer. I did a case, and at that point in time, the families that had come from Vietnam were very poor, and I was invited by the client to come to a housing project, and so I came, and they were very surprised that I would come. And I walked in, and they had no furniture. They had nothing, but they had the wonderful plastic mats on the floor, with many a whole group of women cooking in the kitchen, and they sat me down, and they gave me a Heineken, and this huge meal, right? And this was symbolic of how Vietnamese culture, for instance, would say thank you to someone, right? And nobody spoke English. Nobody. So I didn't have a translator there. I just came, and yet it was probably one of the most wonderful nights of my life, because we didn't need that. We needed to just pay attention to each other. And I think that is where you learn with your wife, if you marry outside of your culture, that each person has to pay very careful attention that, yes, they are being sensitive to their own culture, but the husband and wife has to realize that they have to be sensitive to two cultures. Otherwise, the tendency in this country is to have one culture disappear and the other dominant culture basically take over the heart and minds of the people of whatever race or country that they've come from. So I learned little. She's both. The south of Vietnam at one point in time was Cambodia until it was given to the French, to the Vietnamese, and so she had grown up very poor in a very small village, and her family had, her father had been a prisoner of war. He had been a soldier for the, actually worked for the United States government, and had been kept in a, I think, if you know what a tiger cage is, which is a bamboo cage where someone is hung from a tree, and for years. And the family just barely made it by. And on top of that, there were no, for her central culture, her Cambodian culture, there was no schools. In fact, many of the Cambodians were not allowed to go to schools by the communists. And so they had to sneak to the temples, and the monks taught them how to read and write in Cambodian. So my wife can read and write in Vietnamese and in Cambodian. So I had a whole bunch of cultures to learn about. And I've learned sometimes the hard way. So.
I'm curious to learn a little bit more specifically. Can you remember instances of cultural shock or moments where you kind of had an aha and you're like having to adjust or having to really engrave something in your head to apply it from that time moving forward, knowing that you'll be married to this woman who comes from a very different background?
Yeah, because the understanding of a culture in a marriage where you have two cultures involved requires a respect, but also a series of compromises, because each thing is right. So you can't go on, I know what should be done in a cultural perspective, and the other person saying this is what you do is you work on trying to understand what are the cultural features that are the most important to each person, and they'll be different. So my biggest shock was waking up with my wife and having her, having given her the keys to the house to her mother and father, and having them watching TV in the front room and going through and cooking, and because Northern Europeans are very private people, and so this was something that we had to work out as far as those kinds of cultural. You have one culture that is very oriented toward an openness. I mean, but that is familial. You would not tell your father he couldn't have a key to your house. This would be a real dishonor to someone.
Just to tie that story with some of the other things we talked about, one, being your experience working with nursing homes, is that
Yes.
right? And two, being married to someone who invites their parents into your home. In a nutshell, how would you describe some of the distinctions between what is American culture and what would be Vietnamese culture, as far as how we treat elderly people, how we treat parents, family relations, and that sort of thing? How would you draw the line there?
We see that's an interesting question, because I've been involved with the Vietnamese communities since the end of the war. And so I've watched great changes. And so immediately the Vietnamese families that I saw come into the country lived together. not only not only just the family, but also, a much more extended family. So people would get together and they would live in one house, and when they got enough money they would buy another house, and if one part of the family would move in that house, and then they would, and so they had really, it was a very beautiful sort of respect for their elders, for instance, right? And so you would find that the thing that I felt that was just so beautiful in the culture was that they did not separate their elders from themselves. You see, one of the things that in my own religion that we believe is that as we age, what happens to us is, you get forgetful and that sort of thing, is that as we get older, we become forgetful because our own essence, or our souls, or our brains, starts to discard the things that are no longer useful and important. What we thought was just, the most important things, where my keys are or something, and begins to open up to wisdom. And that wisdom is the wisdom that people have looked for in their elders since the beginning of man. Is that you went to the elders with the problems. You came to the grandfather and the grandmother. You took care of them. My wife took care of her grandmother until the minute she died. And every morning she was paralyzed for a number of years, and she would bathe her, before she'd go to school, and she would feed her. Now this is a little girl, and no one was put out into a institution or a different place. This was a very much the nature of the culture as it came into the United States. But there's been some dramatic changes in what the attitude of people towards the elders. And what's happening is that what I see personally is I see a lot of very old people living by themselves, and this is not everywhere. This is not completely through the Vietnamese culture, but there is this sort of adaptation of the American, where I worked in nursing homes where people had basically discarded the wisest of our kind into the most horrible circumstances, come to visit from time to time, but not to learn and not to be. How can you learn to be if you don't have someone who's older and wiser than you are? And this is religion, this is nature, this is everything that the elders know about, that we've become more and more separated from. So watching the Vietnamese love their grandparents, watching them take care of them, for me was this, was what I had always seen in my efforts to be able to free people from nursing homes. And it's very difficult to convince a family that is going to let their mother and father live somewhere that they're going to come get them. Culturally, unfortunately, in the United States, we've abandoned the best of the hearts and minds of our cultures. But at least we were able to create conditions where we were able to get the federal government, instead of funding people to be locked in a room by themselves, to be able to live together in group homes, to be able to live in little apartments, and to get the elderly, the sick, the infirm, the disabled back into the world. Now, I think a great challenge for the community is that the amount of respect for for the elders is changing. It is acculturation. It is, as you know, being here. We, every culture that crosses, the line and comes into another culture, there is a push to have, to become like everyone else, and I find that pretty sad. Yeah.
On that note, this may be a bit of a loaded question, but you discussed thoroughly sort of the differences, culturally speaking, between what is American culture and Vietnamese culture as far as treating elderly people. Mm-hmm. Since you've kind of had a very front row seat to see from the very beginning, following 75,
right,
with the first mass immigration period, till now, nearly 40 years later, what other aspects of Vietnamese culture has adapted or changed or evolved over that period of time, from your perspective?
One of my very first clients came in, and he was in two Vietnamese gentlemen that were in an auto accident, and I handled it for them. And they filled out the paperwork, and the one gentleman who spoke the most English at that point in time was talking to me, and he said, "Well, this fellow is my brother." We went through all the paperwork, and at one point in time, we got to looking at the dates, and we figured that they could not possibly be brothers. And what it was is that during the war, the one fellow had watched over the family of the other, and so they were brothers. And people who were not related were uncles. And this tie to one another was so different from any culture that I'd ever seen, right? And when you would speak to people about it, they had the hardest time understanding. This person did this. We are brothers. It's not blood. It's not genetics. We're brothers, and we take care of his family. He takes care of my family. You see people who come out back from, someone who'd finally been granted a visa. A lot of soldiers, and I remember one party where a colonel had been allowed to leave the horrible prison that he was in. And when he came, they had a huge party. And all the men that were in his unit were there. And yet, and when they spoke to one another, it was, uncle, cousin, brother. This was a bond that you could not manufacture, right? Now that kind of bond, a bond that takes a community past its own, familial bonds, out into a village bond. There's an old Chinese saying that has something to do with, the family that I build, and the city that comes from it, and the state that comes from that, and the country that comes from that, and the world that comes from all of it, starts in me. And the Vietnamese had a tremendous web of family that had to do with so much more than just having been cousins or aunts or uncles or whatnot. That is something that I've watched diminish. I've even watched it be abused, where someone who was a very close friend of a family had someone who wasn't really a younger person who hadn't grown up in the culture so much come to them and say, could you sign a loan for me, or do this, and then take the property or crash the truck and leave this person you know, with the bill, and having sort of played on this, the fact that this person, you know, was poor, working in a factory, and his signature he would give to any of the people in the family. Never even considered that there could be that someone would cheat him. And then have someone who's younger, who doesn't have the same cultural background, do that. When these came into the office, these were very hard, because this is where I began to see the breakdown of this wonderful web of relationships. And I think that's probably been the hardest thing for me to watch in that.
You mentioned earlier that you were married before your current marriage, and you had, was it 3 children with the first wife?
2.
2. And do you currently have children with your current wife?
No. No, she has 2 children.
She has 2 children from previous?
She was in an arranged marriage.
Can you talk a little bit about what you learned about her arranged marriage, how that works?
That some aspects of culture are better than others. The idea of romantic love is a Western idea. And in a Western or European context, I have, it does us some good and it does us some harm. An arranged marriage is made in such a way that people bind themselves together and they let life teach them to love each other. They let hardship and hard work and the bonds of family and children literally those are the things that make them man and wife. And that is more true than I think than the instant feeling of romantic love, which can go away the minute that something happens, a person is sick or whatnot. So how does love grow? Does it grow from the fact that 2 people together find love because they have built love and they have earned love? Or is it the fact that 2 people have the right chemistry? It's always going to be a question. But the other side of an arranged marriage is that sometimes the person who is the couple is not well suited for each other. And in my wife's circumstance, actually her family decided that they didn't like her husband and forced them to divorce. So this all then comes into a question about whether for a woman is that if you're in a situation where certain choices you can't make, you can live a life that is very sad. And so knowing the way that she grew up, knowing how poor she was, I mean, they survived. That when you do the rice, you go ahead and you sift it out, and then you take the husks off, and then after when the market is closed down at night, right? And I've watched this. I've traveled through Vietnam and different countries, and they would go out at night and find the rice that had fallen on the ground, right? And they would not just go eat it. They would gather enough that they would sell it, and then they would go and find their food. It was a village, so that there was natural food, actually unbelievably wonderful food that's just now you can get it in a Vietnamese grocery store, beautiful green vegetables and fruits and things. So being very poor, they actually were eating in a way that now we all would spend a lot of money too. And the rice was sold, and then that money was used to maintain the family, take care of the grandmother, and do that. My mother grew up in the poorest era in the poorest place in the United States, which was Appalachia, during the Great Depression. And in watching the care that people who have grown up in a circumstance, and you know, Vietnam, 100 years of war, you know, families broken to pieces, all of the suffering, you know, and the poverty, all of the suffering of the soldiers kept captive and kept from their families because she, you know, her mom had to get up every morning and take a little food, and they would allow her to go to the camp because they didn't actually feed him, right? All of these things build a tremendous kind of character, you know, of being able to survive and to understand that life is not all roses. And you know, we have a recession and everybody goes crazy, right? They have no idea what poverty is and that sort of thing.
Do you plan on having kids with your current wife at any point?
You know, she has two, and they are teenagers. My two children are older. They're in one is finished college, one is in college. I feel that her children are my children, and so at this point in time, you know, the question is that why do you bring a child into the world, right? Well, with the amount of resources that we have and looking at a greater picture, I feel, you know, that my emphasis is on her teenage children, right, to be as good a stepfather as I can possibly be, and to add to them whatever it is that I can add in my own experience and education. The love between my wife and I isn't sealed by a child. It's sealed by us. And so we have, let's put it this way, with the children we have a handful.
Sure. What is your relationship like with her children? I understand you are spending a good deal of energy taking them in as your own children and raising them in that respect. What is it like as far as any cultural difficulties directly related to the children as opposed to just your wife? Is that a challenge daily, or how's that relationship?
And this is partly, I think, you know, one of the questions that we spoke about earlier of why you're doing what you're doing here. Her children speak some Cambodian, some Vietnamese, one better than the other. But, you know, they're, you know, American kids. And so with them, the truth is that it's sort of, sometimes I'm in between, you know, not having, you know, being able to explain to grandma and grandpa what the kids are thinking and doing. And so, and my approach to it is that, you know, I came into the family as a stranger. I allowed them to come to me as they wished. I didn't walk in and say, guess who's the dad around here now? They didn't deserve that. And so our relationship grew very slowly. And the trust and the things I was able to add were added because they wanted me to help. You know, and I think that means our relationship is stronger in the sense that, you know, I've never said to them, look, you need to call me dad or this or that. You know, it's a good relationship, and it's multicultural because they themselves they're the transition generation. Actually, they're the third transition generation. But they have because the Cambodians came so late, they actually are closer to than a lot of kids in high schools who are Asian or from other countries. They really are very close to a lot of the traditions that others might not be. This because they may be, in the grand scheme of things, third, but they're actually only second generation.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, the first wave comes, and you have everyone is born in country and comes here, and then so they are a culture. Second generation comes, and they grow up here, and they're generally educated in American schools. The women and the guys that they play soccer with or go to dances with are, from here. They speak English 60% of the time, but they still at home. They come home to a first generation culture. They eat the food of the country that they're from. So they get both Vietnamese and Cambodian food because my wife is an excellent cook. We go to parties, we dance, we go to the weddings, we are involved in the Vietnamese community in the cultural way, so that each of the kids understands the culture really thoroughly. Now, sometimes they don't agree, but they understand. They're there. Third generation kids that I've known sometimes are completely separated from their culture. And this creates a lot of difficulty for their parents, because the parents want to be able to have a communication with them that the child themselves won't accept. And in a sense, I'm going to tell you what to do, and they're going to say, no, you're not. I'm going to go lock myself in my room. And what I've seen from that is that usually the parents are confused. What do I do? How do I approach a child, my child, when they talk to me like that? Because if I talk to my mom like that, well, the consequences would be really grave. This is where you come in and you find that having people aware of educating third and fourth generation, fifth generation, sixth generation people, about their cultures, having them have organizations where they speak in the language and they dance the dances, and they have a strong cultural identity. Of course, they're going to be Americans. They're here, but they're going to be Vietnamese Americans, right? And not in some sort of the fact that you look Vietnamese, but in their heart of hearts. So my children are actually Filipino. I have Filipino, and they, they are very Filipino looking. In fact, when I go to a mall, someone would say, where did you adopt your children? And I would say, well, no, I didn't adopt my children. These are my children, but they're darker skinned, and but I'm their dad. They have a huge pride in their Filipino ancestry, huge. But it was something that really came later in their lives, as they grew up. They became more and more aware, and it was because after that relationship had ended, I made sure that they had constant contact with their Filipino relatives and with their culture and whatnot. So if you were to ask either of my kids, what are you? They would say, I'm a Filipino. I'm a Filipino American. And they, are fiercely proud of that fact. Now, you know, I think that's tremendous, because there's a lot of Scotch-Irish out there, you know, but to be able to have them have a connection to their, you know, I send them back to the Philippines at regular intervals so that they can stay in an ipa hut and, you know, ride the water buffalo, and their villages are very poor, and they love it. They don't have 5 cousins, they have 50 cousins, and they play basketball, you know, without tennis shoes on, and they love, you know, they love being and looking at around and saying to themselves, this is my family. So, you know, I found when in the years when I was working with, and I still work with Spanish culture and Mexican American culture and Salvadorian culture and whatnot, and those youth organizations that I belonged to, which was interesting because here I am, this, you know, really white guy, but I had grown up with so much of let's say, Mexican culture that there wasn't any of it that I didn't understand and respect. And they have made great efforts to educate their kids on what, you know, where you came from, what is your heritage, and right now, you see, when I grew up, you know, we spoke Spanish. The parents would not teach their kids to speak Spanish, because if they went to school, they were punished for speaking Spanish. This is starting to happen again, right? And it's, you know, a huge shame. But there was a period where the country seemed to have lost its fear of other cultures, that people, you know, the Cinco de Mayo festivals and all of that, those were all to remind, to teach. I have a friend who has 8 kids. Grew up with him. He went to school with me. All of his kids, he's half Aztec Indian from Mexico, and he was born here. All of his kids dance the Aztec dances, the ancient dances. A couple of them know how to speak in Aztec, which is still a living language. All of them understand the history of the country from beginning to end, from its indigenous roots and the Spanish invasions, everything that happened, you know. And so in this way, the children are able to grow up knowing that they are people of the world, and that they are, you know, and I think that this is very important for Asian culture here, you know, not to assimilate to such an extent that you forget, you know, all the history that and Asian Vietnamese history by itself is unbelievable. You know, I visited Hue, you know, the city of kings and poets, right? And when I was in Hue, I was just taken aback by the sophistication and beauty, the literature of the Vietnamese culture. Now, if you've never been even told that a place like Hue exists, or Dalat, with its huge trees and its, you know, unbelievable scenery, and you know, places in Vietnam that are so removed that they're still finding animals there that they've never seen, that are newly discovered, literally. I mean, Vietnam is a place that has a cultural heritage second to none, and it would be a shame for the, you know, for the Vietnamese not to have that. You know, that's a strength. You know, even with me being very far removed from my cultural heritage, You know, I'm still Scotch-Irish, and I know what that means, and I knew what it was in my uncles and my ancient parents, and I never met my grandparents because they died of tuberculosis. But this is, you know, we don't need to be separated from our cultures to be part of America. You know, and in fact, as the world looks forward at itself, as we begin to try to understand each other, trying to stop fighting wars over religion and cultural differences and old angers and whatever that is about, that will only come about if there is a absolute respect and understanding of people, of their cultures, and the ability for them to look at other cultures with love, with respect, with heart. You know, we may be different countries, but we are human beings. So these are the things that I think that I grew up in an extraordinary way, because I have several cultures that reside inside of me, and I can go to a Cambodian wedding and I can do the dances, and you know, Cambodians all dance together. Or I can go to a Vietnamese wedding and I can watch as the bride changes her dress through each part, and you know, the ao dai and all of that. And when I'm there, I'm Vietnamese. I'm not an outsider. You know, I'm part. And in my business, when people come in, this is why they come to me, is because even though I'm not, you know, physically, is that they know that I will understand their fears and their needs. You know, someone comes to me and in Vietnamese culture, it's very important for privacy too, because you know, in a lot of cultures, there's people like to talk about each other, and so they like the fact that the very first thing that I say to them is that anything that comes in here is absolutely private. And I am your lawyer. I don't belong to the state. I don't belong to anyone else. And so you can be free. And if you've made a mistake, I won't judge you. Right? I will do everything I can. And the minute that they feel as though that they're protected, and that they know that you know the culture, and that you can go home, you know, if they decide to have you come over for Bumba Hue or whatever, and Heineken, that you'll sit down with the boys and you'll be comfortable and happy. Well, then I become like the cousin we were talking about before, or the uncle, you know, to a lot of families. I love that. And I think Americans could learn a great deal from that kind of wonderful bonds that Vietnamese people naturally have. And I hope, you know, with all my heart, that they don't lose it.
You mentioned a couple of times your trips to Vietnam. I'm curious to know about your first time. Well, first of all, how many times have you been back?
Just one. I was there.
One. Okay.
I was there for almost 3 months. I went to Vietnam because after we had built the orphanage, we looked and we had not gone to Vietnam. We had done it from here. We put the money together. We had a couple of people who went to Vietnam to oversee, make sure that the money had come, would come through. We decided that one of the things that we could do, there was a movie star named Dennis Weaver, and he's famous in Colorado for building sustainable housing, right? Housing that is made out of basically tires and plastic, you know, houses that are made out of other materials and much less expensive. And he was very interested in building houses in Vietnam. because of the war and the decimation of so many of the men in the war. At the time when I went was the beginning of the, I guess you'd call the great baby boom. So there were, families were cropping up without homes. The communists were not building housing. They were leaving people to their own devices. And so we came up with a scheme where we were able to gather a group of people who had different expertise in building houses out of literally trash, that you could build a very basic house and it could be added on, and like you could build a house without plumbing, but the plumbing would be in the walls, so you could add it later on. And we negotiated with the Vietnamese government for months, and we put together a plan to do several projects across Vietnam to provide housing to the very poor. Unfortunately, the people in charge of the government, in every place we went, asked for our backing was a Canadian bank. We were, we had two corporations. We had a company that creates a factory that you can move. So you put the factory at a site, you build the houses, you take the factory up, you move it out. In the same time that you're also collecting in the trash that's being in and turning it into building materials. We were, at one point in time, we were stopped. This is just an example. And there was an old Vietnamese colonel, and he was, this is near Vung Tau. And we had spoken with the authorities about a large area there to be able to build housing. And we went, he took us into a little compound, got us into a room, and then talked about how hard his life was. And he said, "You all are rich." He says, "I'll let you, do your project, but I need you to wire transfer me $1 million today." And the next thing we knew, we had two military people with, I think they probably had AK-47s in the room, and a telephone. And he said, "You're going to transfer this money over to me today, now." And of course, here's all of these American businessmen and our Vietnamese counterparts that are there, but he's the one who controls this area. And we got out of there because I pointed out to him that it was midnight or later in the United States and we couldn't get to our banks. And so he felt confident he could let us go back to the hotels, and then we would come back and give him the money. We got into our combis and we left. We did not hit one place in Vietnam where we were not asked for so tremendous bribes that we were not able to build a single house. Not anywhere. The whole project was had to be dumped. And so it was a huge tragedy, because people had put their time in for free to do this. We felt, okay, build a couple of orphanages. What is it that people need? They need to have shelter over their heads. So that was pretty enlightening. And I was everywhere in the country. I was, the only place I didn't get to was Hanoi. But I was, from Da Nang, all through the country. We had projects set up, but we simply couldn't do them. Today I think it might be different, but in those days, it's 1996. We could not help, even though we were ready to do it using our own money.
When they took you into that room and he made his demand in front of the two soldiers, what exactly was going through your head?
We're gonna die. you'll die here.
Are you afraid?
Well, dying never is the one thing that you really want to do. But I think that something kicks in when you're in a situation like that, because what I instantly felt from him, maybe this is a lawyer's instinct, is that I tend to not listen to the words, or even, I tend to watch and see what is the motivation of the person, what is it they're going, to get out of whatever it is they're negotiating for, what is their demeanor. And I noticed that he was constantly nervous, constantly telling us about the hard life he'd had. And our advantage was the fact that killing us would not have gotten him $1 million. And so, instead of really fear kicking in, and there were a couple of people really had fear kick in. I mean, we lost a couple of people who said, that's it, we're not going anyway. We're not going to the next meeting, we're out of here. My mind said, he needs us alive. Otherwise he doesn't get his money. What good would it be to kill us? And if he did kill us, what would be the repercussions that that would follow from that? Because that was just right at the tip of when the United States and other countries were beginning to have relations with Vietnam again. So by convincing him that we were completely sincere and we would get him his $1 million, I mean, as we were driving out, his wife ran along the side of the car saying, please, please, we need this money, make sure that we get it, and we're just like, then I felt afraid. It was like the fear came afterwards. It was like, whoa, we were just prisoners in a room with, people with basic automatic weapons, and, we, then all of it kicked in. But when you're in the middle of it, you really have to know who you're dealing with. And fortunately, having us alive was much better for him than having us dead.
After that experience, would you ever consider going back?
Oh yes. I think that the Vietnamese people are not the Vietnamese government. The Vietnamese people are the Vietnamese people. And I plan to go back with my wife as soon as we're able, and spend a couple of months in her village, and then go on to Cambodia, where she has family, and into Thailand. And no, my feeling of that experience didn't change anything about what I felt, because you see, everywhere that I went, I was greeted with, not because of what we were offering or trying to do, but in every little restaurant, in every hotel, in every place that we went, in every place I've ever gone, in any home I've ever been, in Vietnam or in the United States, where a Vietnamese family had invited me, for my third or fourth meal of the day, I have never been treated badly. I have never seen such great respect, such sweetness, such hospitality. And this is another mistake that we make about people around the world. We could look at a Muslim and we could say, that is our enemy. But the truth is that a government is different than its people. And the Vietnamese people are the most entrepreneurial, hardest working people that I've ever watched or ever been able to have a real close relationship with. Even in those days, along the highways, there were tiny little shops, hundreds. And you drive down the highway and there'd be hundreds of bicycles and motorcycles, and our combi driver is driving like, man, I'm thinking he's going to hit everybody. And there's car accidents. But there's so much business, so much people coming up with things to do. And that's no different here. I know hundreds of Vietnamese entrepreneurs who have built amazing businesses. I knew, again, one of my first clients. He would come in every day and he would be covered in paint, and he was a very older guy, calluses, and very, very kind. And he looked at me and he was very sweet. He didn't have a bit of superiority or whatever. And I had a wonderful rapport with him, and we worked on his case and finished it up. And he went out. He always came in a little Chevy Cavalier that I don't know how it kept running. Right? It was so beat up. That man was a multimillionaire. And when he had first come to the United States, he had begun buying little apartment houses and his family would come in and fix them up. And he just kept accumulating, selling off some property, buying other properties. He was a very, very wealthy man. And you could not see one bit of what happens to an American when they become wealthy. And all you have to do in Denver, for instance, is go down Federal and take a look and see how many businesses. My wife helps me at my law office. She is one of the top realtors in Colorado, especially in the Vietnamese community, because she's sweet and they trust her. And she also has another business that she runs that allows people to send packages back and forth to Vietnam. So she has 3 businesses, right? And she did them on her own, herself. She was the top salesman in her real estate company this year. And almost all of the business was intercultural business, but not just Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian. So this is, as you may find out in the future, just being a lawyer by itself is a big challenge. But to consider having the patience to run 3 businesses or 4 businesses, the Vietnamese community has been nothing but a great asset to the United States, to Denver. It's just an amazing spirit of hard work and education. The kids that I know go to school. Whatever cultural differences or whatever is going on, that feeling of wanting education and getting education and going on, so when it's my time to pass on my business, I would want to pass it on to a Vietnamese lawyer. Right? That is the way that you see that one day it's all American doctors. It's not anymore, right? Tons of the best doctors are Vietnamese doctors, the nurses, the pharmacists. So this says something about a culture that is not new. This is an ancient drive to produce and to create and to work as hard as you can. That's something that if Americans were smarter, they would be studying the culture and trying to understand and bring in the culture, those cultural values back into the United States where we really need them now.
I believe I've exhausted most of my primary questions. Is there any other segment of your life or any other theme or perspective that you would like to offer at this point?
I think that now that I have an idea of what your project is, and having seen the Vietnamese transition and relationship to the United States from the very beginning, having lived in the culture, having served in the culture. Um, the one thing that is the most important is that we know where we come from. We know what our tradition is. We know our dances. We know our songs. We know our teachings. We know the things that only can be taught to us by our elders. And, you know, I would hope that there'd be a much stronger effort to bring people, you know, bring young people at a much younger age into the culture, you know, preserve so that they know the language and they understand things as children, so that their children can know the language and the culture and theirs, because that is that's what's at stake and that's what's in danger at this point.
I want to thank you for your time and for providing what turned out to be one of the most intriguing and interesting interviews that I've done personally. It was very interesting to hear a different perspective from someone who isn't genetically or physically Vietnamese, yet knows worlds and worlds more than most people my age, I would say, about culture, the significance, and its implications. Is there any other remarks or any other advice you would give to the viewing audience, not just the Vietnamese American community, but to all who might be interested in learning about Vietnamese American history?
Well, I think that right now that the textbooks are inadequate. I think the way that you learn about Vietnamese culture is to go into the restaurants, go into the areas, and sit down and talk to people and get to know people on a friendship to friendship level, and, you know, show the interest. You know, we Americans tend to think, oh, we go to a Vietnamese restaurant and, you know, but when I walk into a place, I want to know about the people who served me the food and where the food came from and what, you know. So I think that, you know, that I guess my culture really needs to do exactly what I had suggested for you. We need to know the Vietnamese culture better. We need to really see that the American dream is going to depend on a different thing. It's depended on one thing for a long time, but now it's going to need to really learn from the Vietnamese and the culture that this country can only be great if we work hard and we expect less and we live more simply and we cherish our traditions in a different way. So we really have a lot more to learn from you guys than I think people would care to admit.
Just to lighten the mood in this interview, what is your favorite dish? You say your wife was a great cook, and I believe you.
Oh, I'm Bun Ba Hui. I eat a lot of pho.
Sure.
Because you know, if you're on federal, you're going to eat pho 2 or 3 times a week.
Right.
But I have been absolutely blessed with being able to eat everything from Vietnamese pizza.
Oh, wow.
You might want to say what the proper name for that is.
The phrase escapes my memory at this point, but if you would like to describe
Well,
what you think it is or what you know of it.
What Vietnamese pizza is that a duck is slaughtered and then hung upside down, and the blood comes out and is preserved, and it is preserved. The meat is chopped very finely, and then the blood and the meat are put together with other ingredients to preserve them and make them safe. But it's raw. And then it's served with a wonderful, delightful set of different vegetables, and you eat the two together with sort of a sesame cracker. Now, the first time that I walked into a big dinner, everybody was testing me. So I got tested a lot. And so the first thing I got tested with was duck eggs. Chop off the top of the egg, the duck heads that comes out. But, you know, I've eaten all over the world, so I ate the duck eggs, and everybody was like, got tested a lot about whether I, you know, drink Heineken. But when they brought out the Vietnamese pizza, and I started to, I watched how everybody ate it, and I went ahead and began to eat. A couple of people started to laugh, and then I asked them. I said, "What are they laughing at?" They said, "Well, he doesn't know what that is." The funny thing is that I had just a couple of days ago, before that, had a friend describe it and tell me what it was, and it was wonderful. You know, I'd eat Vietnamese pizza anytime I could get my hands on it. So when I go to a place where people are eating, they always expect me. You know, it's really kind of this thing that, oh, you're not going to eat the food. You know, well, I am going to eat the food because Vietnamese food is the best food in the world, right? But if you're a white guy, you get tested. You know, and that didn't faze me at all, and certainly they anticipated that I was going to be a little freaked out with eating raw duck and the blood.
Well, I give you credit for that, because that's more than I can handle.
You see,
you got me beat.
I've got one little piece of Vietnamese that you don't.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for
welcome.
coming in. It was a great interview, like I said. I think I learned a lot as far as kind of a different take on Vietnamese culture, history, and the significance of both. So thank you so much, and that's a wrap.
Yeah, go to Hue
Yeah.
and see what the kings built.